The disco decade came to an end with anthems that would last. Do You Think I'm Sexy by Rod Stewart for the boys, I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor for the girls, and YMCA by the Village People for those that couldn't make their minds up. In world events, the Shah of Iran was overthrown, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of Britain, and the Walkman went on sale. Top new cars of the year, the Mercedes S-Class and the Honda Prelude. In the Grand Prix world, Mario Andretti was world champion. He'd won it with Lotus and he was staying there for 1979. He had a new teammate in Carlos Reutemann, whose seat at Ferrari had been filled by Jody Scheckter. Scheckter had been replaced at Wolf by James Hunt, whom McLaren had replaced with John Watson. It wasn't all musical chairs, however. Niki Lauda had stayed with Brabham. The third Grand Prix of the year, after the South American events in Argentina and Brazil, was the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami. As the cars left the new pit complex for practice, it was obvious that the designers had been busy during the winter. Their task was to come up with something to counter the Lotus 79, which had been almost unbeatable the previous season. The Lotus was the first wing car, which used an aerofoil section like a reversed aircraft wing to make the car stick to the track. That meant a slim central section that housed the driver, the fuel tanks, the engine and much of the suspension. The units on either side that formed the aerofoil sections were fitted with skirts to control the flow of air under the car. Watching the cars from head-on like this showed how each team had approached the problem and how similar the designers' responses had been. The man to beat at Kyalami was Jacques Lafitte. He'd won both South American races in a new Ligier designed with the help of French aerodynamicists. The JS11 was the first fruit of a new collaboration with Cosworth for engines. Previously, the Ligier had been an all-French affair, with Matra V12 power units, but Matra had withdrawn from racing. It was a benefit for Ligier, for the Ford Cosworth was more compact and better suited to a wing car design. Lafitte's back-to-back wins had proved the team had got everything right, except perhaps for fixing the mirrors. The other big change at Ligier was that the team had gone from concentrating on just one car for Lafitte to running two. Patrick Depailler had joined from Tyrrell to drive the second entry, and he was fitting in well. He'd finished fourth in Argentina and second in Brazil. Experienced and safe, he was an excellent addition to the team. After 2 years with Ferrari and 5 Grand Prix wins for them, Carlos Reutemann had moved on this year to Lotus, the second driver to Mario Andretti. The pairing gave Colin Chapman one of the most experienced teams in racing. The cars Andretti and Reutemann were driving were now Lotuses again. The agreement with John Player cigarettes that had meant for the past 6 years Lotuses had been John Player specials had come to an end. And for 1979, the Lotuses carried the Martini colours and their own name. James Hunt was also in a new car, having left McLaren, a team that often ran 3 or 4 cars, for Wolf, where 1 was the maximum. He replaced Jody Scheckter, who'd joined Ferrari alongside Gilles Villeneuve. Here, in front of his home crowd, Scheckter had qualified second. On pole, thriving in the elevated altitude of Kyalami, was the turbocharged Renault. At the start, however, Scheckter and Villeneuve, third on the grid, took the inside advantage of Jabouille in the French car. But the challenge came to nothing, for after 2 laps, heavy rain stopped the race. African rain doesn't last long, and after a delay, there was a restart on the wet track. Most drivers started on wet tyres, but Scheckter trusted his local knowledge and ran slicks, guessing that the track would dry. He knew he would be at a disadvantage at first, but he counted on not having to stop when the surface became unsuitable for wet weather tyres. Villeneuve took the lead ahead of Scheckter, Jabouille, Lauda and Jarier, but between the 10th and 15th laps, everyone, except Scheckter, came in for dry tyres. Villeneuve stayed out as long as possible, and smooth Ferrari pit work got him out very quickly. He had lost only 1 place, but that place was first, and he had lost it to his teammate, whose tactics seemed to have paid off. As the sun grew hotter, so did the competition on the track. Crowthorne Bend, the fast corner at the end of the start and finish straight at Kyalami, was always a good place to watch the action, although newcomer Elio De Angelis probably wished there were fewer people watching when he put his shadow off and into the catch fencing. Fortunately, he was able to walk away. The sun was welcomed by the spectators, but it didn't do Jody Scheckter any favours. After 50 laps, he found his dry tyres were going off, and he had to stop for a new set. The result was that he handed the lead back to Villeneuve, and although the Ferrari mechanics also got him in and out so quickly that he lost only 1 place, it was again the place that mattered first. With around 25 laps left, he wasn't able to get ahead of Villeneuve. Behind the 2 Ferraris, Jarier, Andretti and Reutemann were in pursuit, and Jones made a spectacular exit when his suspension failed at full speed in front of the pits. The Australian was lucky the car stayed off the loose areas on either side of the track. Villeneuve took the flag just over 3 seconds ahead of Scheckter, giving Ferrari's new 312 T4 a superb debut. The car adopted wing car principles around an engine that was the worst possible format for such a design. An ideal wing car has a narrow central fuselage and a narrow engine. However, Ferrari's strength lay in its superb flat 12 Boxer engine. A Boxer, the widest possible power unit, therefore presents great difficulties to the aerodynamics specialists. That the Ferrari design team had overcome the problems was a tribute to their skills. Their drivers had the ability, now they had the car too. Long Beach, California. Downtown Long Beach, California. In the US Grand Prix West, the nearest Mexico's Hector Rebaque would get to his home ground. Independently wealthy, Rebaque had brought personal sponsorship from Mexico to the Lotus team. James Hunt gets dressed in public, no doubt to the delight of his female fans. As James shows, the safety clothing a Grand Prix driver wore extended right down to his fireproof socks. A newcomer to the Grand Prix scene, Jan Lammers, checks an experimental fresh air system in his shadow. Didier Pironi, in his 2nd year with Tyrrell, has a final check with engineer Brian Lyle before the bodywork goes on and he sets off to practice. The design of the new Tyrrell 009 was very similar to that of the Lotus. The new Brabham had a 60-degree V12 Alpha engine in place of last year's flat 12. It was narrower, so designer Gordon Murray got nearer to the wing car ideal. Nevertheless, Lauda still seemed unhappy with the handling. With 3 races run, Andretti only had 5 championship points to his name. No wonder he and Colin Chapman looked glum. And so the class of 79 went out to practice, led by Lauda. Jody Scheckter, Hector Rebaque, Jochen Mass, Gilles Villeneuve, Arturo Mezzario, James Hunt, Riccardo Patrese, Didier Pironi, Mario Andretti, Emerson Fittipaldi with Derek Daly almost hidden behind him, Nelson Piquet, Patrick Tambay, John Watson, Jan Lammers, Hans Stuck, René Arnoux, Alan Jones, Clay Regazzoni, Elio De Angelis, Jean-Pierre Jarier, Carlos Reutemann, and finally Jacques Lafitte. The only ones missing were Depailler and Jabouille. Missing from the start were the two Renaults. Perhaps they were lucky. Keep an eye on the middle of the pack. For Patrick Tambay and Niki Lauda, the US Grand Prix West lasted less than a lap. As they cleared away Tambay's McLaren in its unfamiliar Lowenbrau beer colours, Villeneuve was coming through to lead the second lap. In fact, he led every lap, with Scheckter a consistent second. Behind them, Jones, Andretti, Depailler and Jarier scuffled over the next 4 places, but none of them could challenge the Flying Ferraris. At the flag, even Scheckter was left behind by the Canadian, who finished a whisker under half a minute ahead of his teammate. Jones, in third, was a further half minute behind the South African. The diminutive Villeneuve might have been lost in the crowd that surrounded the podium, but in a race characterised by Ferrari and Michelin domination, he'd shown that in the cockpit he was a big man. Villeneuve's 2 wins in succession put him in the lead for the championship, with 20 points to Scheckter's 13. Things looked good for Ferrari and its drivers. The Spanish Grand Prix at Jarama, and the Ferrari team of Villeneuve, Scheckter and designer Forghieri were the ones to beat. Ferrari had won the last 2 races, but Ligier and this man, Jacques Lafitte, had won the first 2, so the French team was eager to prove it hadn't lost the touch. And it hadn't. At the end of practice, Lafitte was on pole and teammate Patrick Depailler was second. Villeneuve was third and Andretti, in a new car, the Lotus 80, was fourth. Niki Lauda was sixth, next to Scheckter on row 3 of the grid. Gilles Villeneuve sat quietly in his car while team manager Antonio Tomini watched the weather. It was cool, but rain wasn't forecast. As they were strapped into their cars, the drivers could count on a race without tyre changes. The grid formed up and all eyes were on the Ligiers on the front row. Among those watching, with Colin Chapman from the Lotus pit, was former Grand Prix driver Innes Ireland, wearing his usual check cap. Despite a lunge on the outside by Andretti, the 2 Ligiers held their lead at the start. Depailler was first, heading up the hill behind the pits with the whole field snaking behind him. Although Andretti's attack hadn't succeeded, his teammate Reutemann had made a good start. From 8th on the grid by the end of the first lap, he was up to 4th behind Villeneuve and ahead of Scheckter. By lap 4, Reutemann was third after passing Villeneuve. Perhaps showing his youthful impetuosity, the Canadian tried too hard to take the place back. He spun, taking Arnoux with him. Fortunately, both were able to continue. James Hunt was not, however. He retired with braking problems. The 2 Ligiers were clearly the class of the field and had pulled out an impressive lead over the rest, led by Reutemann, Scheckter, Andretti and Lauda. Jones, racing the new Williams FW07 for the first time, was not enjoying himself. After this slow pit stop, he finally retired with a broken gearbox. Ligier's day was spoilt when Lafitte missed a gear and wrecked his engine while racing his own teammate for the lead. Dupaille was left to cruise home 21 seconds ahead of a group of Reutemann, Andretti, Scheckter and Jarier, who crossed the line with just 10 seconds between second and fifth. Dupaille's second Grand Prix victory, his first for his new team, was greeted in typically Gallic manner with a kiss for team boss Guy Ligier and congratulations from engineer Gérard Ducarouge. With 3 wins in 5 races, the small French team, led with Truelin by ex-racer Guy Ligier, was making a significant mark on Formula One. The Belgian Grand Prix at Zolder and the Irish are sticking together, although John Watson from the north spends his time closer to the front of the grid than does Derek Daly from the south. Between practice, there's time for giving autographs or just chatting with friends, as Patrick Tambay was. Jody Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve were probably talking about their cars. The needle-nosed Ferrari 312 T4 with its massive front wing was the only competition for Ligier so far this season. At McLaren, Patrick Tambay and John Watson were finding that this year's M28 was not working as it should. It had already gone through one major redesign and it still wasn't right. There was much more work to be done. Practice saw the Ligiers dominant once again, with Lafitte on pole and Dupaille second. A surprise third was Nelson Piquet in the Brabham, while Alan Jones was fourth. As the lights went out, a strong challenge from Piquet and Jones split the two Ligiers. Dupaille was in the lead, but Lafitte was down to fourth by the time he went through the first corner. Halfway through the first lap, the order was Dupaille, Piquet, Jones, Lafitte, Andretti, Regazzoni and Scheckter and Villeneuve in the Ferraris. At the end of the lap, Jones was hard on the heels of Dupaille, with the rest close behind him. Back in the pack was a new face, the unusual nose of number 35, painted in the red of Italy. And so it should be. It was the new Alfa Romeo, driven by Bruno Giacomelli. Halfway through lap 2, and the battle at the head of the race is still intense. A little too intense between Villeneuve and Regazzoni. Regazzoni can't believe his bad luck and just sits there. Villeneuve was luckier. After a stop at the pits for a new nose, he was able to continue. Regazzoni had to walk home. As he watched how fast his teammate's car was, he must have had some very uncharitable thoughts about Villeneuve, who'd attacked him from behind. Dupaille continued to hold off the attack from Jones, while Jones himself was being harried by Lafitte. For a car in its first race, the Alfa was going well, holding 15th place and leading the Renaults of Jabouille and Arnoux. Jabouille was driving a new car, the RS10, designed around wing car principles. Dupaille and Jones were pulling ahead a little, and Scheckter was looking for a way past Lauda. The race was beginning to settle into a pattern, with some top drivers like Watson and Fittipaldi finding themselves at the back of the pack. Neither McLaren nor Kopasuka had been able to build an effective wing car, and they were losing ground. Elio De Angelis, at the back of the pack in the shadow, was moving up the lap chart as Giacomelli in the Alfa began to slip down. Unfortunately, they met in the middle and it spelt retirement for both. The battle between the two Ligiers and the Williams was getting even hotter now. They passed and repassed, and finally, after 24 laps, Jones did take the lead. He wasn't a last, however, and 15 laps later the Australian dropped out when his fuel pump died on him. Next to drop out among the leading bunch was Lauda, whose engine expired. Then Depailler made a mistake and ended up in the catch fencing. Lafitte inherited the lead, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from Scheckter. Ferrari's number one was on top form and took first place with 16 of the 70 laps to go. At the flag, Scheckter had a lead of just over 15 seconds over Lafitte, while Pironi, who was third for Tyrrell, was a further 20 seconds behind. Villeneuve, who dropped to last after tangling with Regazzoni, made his way back through the field and was actually in third place, and then he ran out of fuel on the last lap. He was still classified as a finisher, however, but just out of the points in 7th place. It had looked like a Ligier and Goodyear event, but Ferrari and Michelin had Scheckter as their secret weapon. He had driven hard and consistently, avoiding the errors that others had committed. The score was now 3 wins each to Ligier and Ferrari, and fittingly, their lead drivers shared first place in the Drivers' Championship with 24 points each. The Navy was lying offshore at Monaco during Grand Prix weekend, but the real off-track action would be in the harbour itself, where yachts would be the venue for many of the best parties. As well as parties, Monaco is popular for meetings. Mario Andretti and Niki Lauda weren't sure that going to a Goodyear meeting would be worthwhile.
Can't get any more qualifiers out of that meeting, that's for sure. Not worth going though. Not worth going for sure.
John Watson and James Hunt had their own meeting schedule, with James' girlfriend as a forceful chairperson. Niki Lauda and Patrick Tambay were discussing where they preferred to be on the grid with the Goodyear men and Nelson Piquet in his first year of Formula One and still very quiet.
That's where you get the aggravation.
Thank God.
I'd like to be up front every weekend too.
Patrick wasn't even at the back of the grid. He failed to qualify for the second race in succession. McLaren were having problems, but Regazzoni and the Williams team were in good shape. Clay even had time to check that his name was spelt correctly in the programme. Another team where everything was going well was Ferrari. Scheckter's experience and Villeneuve's youthful enthusiasm were a good combination, and the car was among the best. Renault's latest innovation was twin turbochargers, which smoothed the engine's power delivery. As the engines burst into life and practice began, it was Ferrari that had the advantage. Scheckter took pole and Villeneuve was beside him. They were ahead of Depailler's Ligier and Lauda's Brabham, while on the third row, Lafitte in the second Ligier was marginally quicker than Jarier in the Tyrrell. With 3 12-cylinder cars in the first 4 places, it seemed power was what counted here, which was a disadvantage for those less well-funded Ford-powered teams like Ensign, who received no special treatment from Cosworth. For Derek Daly, this meant failing to qualify. Lotus and Andretti did get special Cosworths, but the Lotus 80 wasn't at its best here and Mario qualified 13th. However, with Tissot as a sponsor, Colin Chapman also got the latest watches. Operating them was a different matter, however.
Can you put this under stopwatch for me? Make that into a stopwatch. Which button do I push? I want this watch as a stopwatch. Which one do I push? For a stopwatch? I don't know.
The arrival of the Prince is the traditional opening of the Grand Prix, but soon the photographers were turning back to the track and the start. Scheckter used his pole position advantage and led up the hill and through Casino Square with Lauda, who got past Villeneuve, already a few lengths behind him. By lap 2, Villeneuve had passed Lauda and was beginning to chase his team leader. Behind the Canadian, Lauda led the two Ligiers, Pironi and the pursuing pack. As Villeneuve gradually reeled Scheckter in, it began to look as though the junior team member was making a point. Team orders might say I can't overtake was the message, but if I wanted the lead, I could take it anywhere. For some laps, it looked as though the Ferrari pair would have it all their own way, until, that is, Alan Jones got his act together. The white Williams began to creep up on Villeneuve, and the crowd, feeling there was a real battle in prospect, reacted accordingly. It wasn't to be, however. Jones fell victim to the biggest danger at Monaco. He hit a curb and was forced to retire. Soon after, Villeneuve hit trouble too as smoke from a failing gearbox trailed him into the pits and out of the race. Scheckter was all on his own now, but as he passed the tip-top bar, went through the old Mirabeau hairpin and headed down towards the sea and the tunnel, another white Williams was coming through Casino Square and catching up fast. Clay Regazzoni, who'd been 15th on the first lap, was now second, and he had the bit between his teeth. Even though he was fighting a gearbox with a faulty second speed, on the circuit with more low-gear corners than any other, he attacked the gap between him and the leader. On the last lap, he was within a length or two of Scheckter, but not close enough to get past. As the flag came down, the gap between the two cars was under half a second. Monaco marked the halfway mark in the World Championship, and this was the point at which, under the strange rules of the time, drivers discarded their two lowest scores and totalled up the rest to provide a mid-season total. Scheckter's was 30, putting him 6 ahead of Lafitte. The French Grand Prix, held last year at Paul Ricard on the Mediterranean coast, was back at the Dijon-Prenois circuit in Burgundy this year, with a new car and driver changes at major teams. The new car, the gold-coloured Arrows A2 bearing number 29, was the wingiest wing car of them all. Designer Tony Southgate had tried everything to make his new creation the ultimate negative effect flying wing. He even tilted the Cosworth V8 to fit the shape better. It certainly stood out among the other Lotus-influenced designs. Keke Rosberg was now in a car worthy of his talent. He was in the Wolf following James Hunt's decision after Monaco that he was going to quit because, he said, he was fed up with Formula One. Jody Scheckter, leading the championship, certainly wasn't fed up, and neither, after his storming display in Monaco, was Clay Regazzoni. John Watson may have been dissatisfied with his results, as might Carlos Reutemann and Mario Andretti at Lotus, but it's unlikely that any of them was thinking of walking out. The Swedish Grand Prix had been cancelled, so Renault had had 5 weeks of testing and improvement, and the team turned up at Dijon with new cars for both Jabouille and Arnoux. The wing car bodies had been fine-tuned, as had the twin-turbo engine, with the result that Jabouille was on pole and Arnoux was beside him on the front row. No wonder the man from Michelin was looking pleased. Following the two Renaults in the practice times was Gilles Villeneuve, another happy user of the tyres from Clermont-Ferrand. René Arnoux had reason to look happy on his home ground. Elio De Angelis, on the last row of the grid, had less to smile about. Regazzoni was on the 5th row behind Jones. The second new driver in the field, although hardly new, was Jacques Ickx. He was replacing Patrick Depailler at Ligier after Patrick had damaged his legs in a hang gliding accident. Nelson Piquet was making a big impression. He qualified 4th fastest. Patrese and Giacomelli were 19th and 17th respectively, while Pironi was 11th. Bernie Eccleston and Niki Lauda would have wanted better than 6th, while Mass, giving the Arrows A2 its first outing, must have hoped for better than the 11th row. However, such a radical design was sure to have teething troubles. Carlos Reutemann had chosen a bad year to join Lotus. He was now a regular halfway down the grid. Jones, on the other hand, couldn't have been happier, although he didn't look it. He'd been progressing smoothly all year and was on the 4th row. Patrese, in the second Arrows A2, was on the 10th row. If only the car could be as fast as it looked. Emerson Fittipaldi must have been frustrated that the Coppiceau car wasn't achieving better results, but Scheckter had nothing to complain about. All he had to do was get past the Renaults at the start. He didn't, but a Ferrari did. Villeneuve shot through from the 2nd row, leaving Jabouille and Arnoux in his wake. Arnoux, in fact, was overwhelmed, and as the field roared through the dips of the Dijon circuit for the first time, he was down in 8th place, while Villeneuve held a solid lead. But Jabouille was being canny. Loaded with fuel, he had let Villeneuve get ahead. Around halfway, the Ferrari's brakes and tyres began to suffer. Jabouille's maintained their edge, and he took the lead. Arnoux, meanwhile, had been climbing back up through the field. As the final laps approached, he was within striking distance of Villeneuve, and over the last 3 laps, they fought a no-holds-barred battle that saw Villeneuve come off best by a mere 26/100ths of a second. As well as being Jabouille's first win, this was Renault's first Grand Prix victory since 1906, and it was Michelin's first 1-2-3 finish. The flying wasn't all in the air at the British Grand Prix. During practice at Silverstone, Alan Jones had completed a lap at 146.84 miles per hour, the fastest ever round Britain's premier Grand Prix circuit. Gilles Villeneuve, 13th on the grid, wasn't so happy. The Ferraris were not at their best here, for Jody Scheckter was also badly placed. He was 11th. Parked in the pits with many of their body panels and their wheels off, the Maranello cars looked surprisingly slim. Alfa had designed a new, slimmer V12 engine last year, but Niki Lauda's Brabham still wasn't a true wing car like the Lotus or the Ligier. The French team had followed the lead of wartime pilots and Lotus by adding badges to mark their successes. For a young organisation, the total wasn't bad. Parachuted in at Wolf after James Hunt's surprise departure, Keke Rosberg qualified 14th. Jabouille, second on the grid, and his Renault mechanics were probably not as concerned with racing history as was the typically British commentator.
Ever held in Great Britain. The fastest Brooklands lap was just over 143 miles an hour on a banked circuit. We're talking about an ordinary road with lots of corners and a chicane. I think we're going to beat the Brooklands record for the fastest race ever held in Great Britain here at Silverstone, where it belongs.
Jones' time was over half a second faster than Jabouille and almost a second and a half faster than teammate Clay Regazzoni, 4th on the grid. Piquet was 3rd fastest in practice and Lauda was 5th, probably not happy to be out-qualified by the youngster.
New innovation in Formula One racing. The pit road is now closed. Any car has to go up it.
Both Piquet and Lauda were in Brabham cars, But the man whose name those cars carried, Jack Brabham, was on the grid with Mario Andretti and Colin Chapman. Gilles Villeneuve was talking brakes with the man from AP, an English supplier to Italy's foremost race car constructor. At the start, it was a Williams that took the lead, but it could have been Regazzoni, not Jones. The Swiss driver had caught out those ahead of him on the grid. But by the time the cars came round to complete the first lap, Jones was where he was expected to be, in the lead. Although it had been given a chicane to slow speeds down, Silverstone's Woodcut corner was still blindingly fast, especially to cars equipped with skirts. The fastest of those cars, on this circuit at least, was the Williams. As team owner Frank Williams pored over his timing notes, he must have been feeling very proud. After 21 laps, Jabouille, the only driver who seemed capable of challenging Jones, retired with a broken valve spring. Worried about the heat, the Williams pit signalled Jones to conserve his tyres. Sure enough, the heat was to spoil his charge, but it was an overheated engine, not tyres, that forced him out on lap 39. But as one Williams dropped out, another took its place. Clay Regazzoni had been holding second spot and immediately flashed into the lead. Jones might have problems, but a white car was still the one to beat, and the pit crew knew it. At the flag, Regazzoni was more than 24 seconds ahead of Arnoux, another number 2 driver who'd taken over when his team leader dropped out. Third was Jarrier in the Tyrrell. A group of cars prepare for the German Grand Prix. After the win at Silverstone, another high-speed track, Regazzoni and the Williams were strongly fancied. However, 6th on the grid here was far from ideal. Gilles Villeneuve, carefully preparing his helmet, must have been disappointed with his Silverstone result. He finished in last place after a loss of fuel pressure late in the race, and a relatively low 9th on the grid here probably didn't fill him with confidence. Keke Rosberg also suffered from low fuel pressure at Silverstone, and it put him out of the race. 17th on the grid here did nothing to raise spirits in the Wolf camp. Jacques Lafitte could be more confident. He'd put the Ligier into 4th place after qualifying. Jones was on top form, but he still had to give best to Jabouille in the Renault, which beat him to pole by just 27 hundredths of a second. Villeneuve was 9th on the grid and Scheckter 5th, so the Ferraris would have to try hard here. The crowd of over 120,000, all seated in the cacophonous cauldron that is the Hockenheim Stadium, could look forward to an exciting race. Despite Jabouille's pole position, it was Jones that smoked ahead at the start, beating the French pair of Jabouille and Lafitte into the first corner. As the crowd strained to see who was in the lead, the cars came back into the stadium. It was Jones ahead from Jabouille, Lafitte, Scheckter, Regazzoni and Lauda. As Jones flashed through the stadium for lap after lap, it was clear the Williams was the fastest car on the track. Jabouille dropped out after 8 laps, and on lap 13 Regazzoni passed Lafitte to take over second place and underline the supremacy of the Williams FW07 and the work of designer Patrick Head. Jones and Regazzoni finished just under 3 seconds apart, with Lafitte another 15 seconds behind. Frank Williams must have felt ecstatic. Hold on tight as we hitch a ride on Patrick Tambay's McLaren on a wet track at Zandvoort. We started on the corner called Poeleveld, then it's maximum revs along the start and finish straight past the pits and into the most famous corner on the track, Tarzan. Tarzan takes us around 180 degrees and it's difficult in the dry. In the wet, well, you be the judges of that. Patrick's no sooner out of Tarzan than he's into Hunsrück, and the McLaren's fighting for grip everywhere. Since Hockenheim, there'd been the Austrian Grand Prix, and once again Alan Jones had won. Jody Scheckter was second, helping his championship campaign, and Jacques Lafitte third. But Jones was the man currently on form. Regazzoni had been fifth in Austria, but here he was third on the grid, just beaten by Jones. Once again it was a Renault, this time Arnoux, that was on pole. Villeneuve, sixth on the grid, was still learning about such things as analysing the temperature sheets handed to him by the tyre technicians. Scheckter, one place ahead, was calm and contemplative. He had plenty of experience of such matters, and he used it. As the cars set out for practice, they're led by Fittipaldi and Villeneuve. Next up is Patrick Gaillard, making a one-off appearance in the end side. Behind him are all the usual suspects. The start, and while Jones gets away safely, Regazzoni and Arnoux come together on the left of the grid. Regazzoni loses a wheel and is out immediately, and Arnoux doesn't finish the lap. Clear of the collision, Jones and Villeneuve led Jabouille, Pironi and the rest of the field into the Hunsrück. Jones was finding that he could contain Villeneuve's pursuing Ferrari, but the Canadian was putting him under pressure. After 10 laps, the pressure paid off, and Villeneuve took the lead with Jabouille behind him. Jones was third, but he was soon ahead of the Renault and attacking the Ferrari. On lap 47, the harried Villeneuve spun. 2 laps later, his rear tyre blew with the following results. Anyone who doubts the determination of the Canadian should watch closely. A tyre like that needs gentle treatment, but Villeneuve didn't know how to drive slowly. Jones was now in an unchallenged lead, and the Ferrari pits were due for a visitor. It had started as a puncture, but by the time Villeneuve got back to the pits, the entire right-hand rear corner of the car had been destroyed. Again, it has to be said that Villeneuve didn't know how to drive slowly, and that was his unique strength. He broke cars, but he drove them like no one else could. Out on the track, Scheckter was passing Rabac, not a difficult thing to do. But the Ferrari team leader was now lying second. A serious-faced Frank Williams was probably sure Jones was safe, but in racing you never count your chickens, at least not until the flag drops, and then you can smile as much as you like. It was smiles all round in the Williams camp, but it seemed an age before Ferrari could cheer Jody home second. In fact, it was 21.783 seconds. As he stepped from his car, Jones told a Dutch reporter of the problems he'd met during the race.
Did you choose the race? Yes, I had 25 laps to go. I was jumping out of second gear, and then I lost third gear altogether. But for the rest it was no problem to keep the lead, and I think you could be very nervous that Scheckter will pick up the first place, you reckon? Or? I was more nervous that the car was going to lose its gears. I see. Okay.
Schecter's 6 points moved him even further ahead in the championship, and it was more and more unlikely that he could be beaten. He was working the way Lauda had before him, trusting the reliability of his car and picking up points at every opportunity. There's no more enthusiastic crowd than a Monza crowd, and when that crowd knows a Ferrari championship is in prospect, the atmosphere is electric. The World Championship rules had been changed for 1979, and drivers could only count their top 4 finishes in each half of the season for championship points. Scheckter had scored consistently all year, and if he won here, he could take the championship. Jones, who had a good second half but had only scored 4 points in the first half, was not a potential champion. Lauda had done it all before, and he could afford to smile. Arnoux and Jabouille didn't have too many championship points, but they were on the front row of the grid here. Their time would surely come. The crowd's time came when the lights went out and the pack was unleashed towards the first chicane. All except Jones, that is. The Aussie made an awful start and was swiftly overwhelmed as Scheckter took command of what could be the most important race of his life. By lap 2, however, it was Arnoux in the lead, with Scheckter chasing as the field streamed through the second of Monza's 2 chicanes. Arnoux dropped back on lap 12, retiring a couple of laps later with ignition problems. This left Scheckter and Villeneuve ahead, providing a sight that drove the packed grandstands wild. 2 Ferraris leading the Italian Grand Prix with the prospect of a world championship for the winner was enough to excite any red-blooded Italian. And when it happened, Jody Scheckter wasn't the only one to punch the air in jubilation. Jody Scheckter was the first South African to win the world title and was certainly the most successful of the few of his countrymen who had competed at the top level in motorsport. He'd won the title by doing what he did best, driving the car quickly, without taking unnecessary risks, and with great mechanical sympathy. He'd shown great skill at Tyrrell and with Wolff, but this year, with the backing of the Ferrari team and its engineering resources, he'd been able to show his best. Villeneuve had the flashes of brilliance, but Scheckter got the results. Among the newcomers to the championship, the most important was a car rather than a driver. 1979 saw the first victory for a turbocharged car. Renault had showed the way to the future. The points totals, reflecting each driver's best 8 results out of 16 races, make the championship look closer than it was. Scheckter would still have won if every round had counted, and he would still have won with 2 races left to run. He was a very worthy champion.